that Kalvin Cummings said yes to speaking to us, particularly for this mini-series, What Do You Wish We Knew? Because he has been an important contributor to our seminary community, both when he was a student and now even as an alum. We grew as a seminary because of his presence here. I remember a few years back in Christology when the class had just finished reading James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. It was the first time I had assigned that book in class, and I asked students what the experience was like reading the book. And most students expressed dismay and heartache, shock. And then in a quiet moment, Kalvin answered the question and said, "What I feel is relief, validation. Finally, someone is speaking to my experience." In Women Theologians, he honed in on the voice of his womanist sisters in ways that were exemplary, leaning in. He even called up and interviewed Dr. Emily Towns. I couldn't believe it. And they had the most amazing conversation. Since graduating, he's been open to God's leading on his life, and I consider him on loan to the counseling department at Milligan, where after he will do good theological work. Even still, he has served as a consultant for our seminary students, planning the trip to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and helping us think through the issues around that and how to speak well and learn together well on that trip. He is so impressively generous and open, and part of that generosity and openness is a willingness to say and speak truth from his own experience and orientation in the world. He will speak generous things and hard things to us today, and hope you welcome him with me today.
I did not know Dr. Perkins was introducing me. I wasn't nervous until then. It seems that land has been a long-standing issue of contention. I remember when I was young, my grandfather would wake my brother and I. He would toast bread and cook rice and eggs for breakfast. While we ate out of tinfoil plates, my grandfather would tell us city boys what he hoped we would accomplish in the fields that day. We would listen with dread and know that his hopes could not be contested by our mannish gripes. By daybreak, we would be strapped in a single-row pickup truck on our way to Sharon, Mississippi. Only in retrospect do my brother and I look back on these trips fondly. They involved what we thought of at the time as hard work and long days in the sun. We weren't tilling the ground or harvesting crops. We were merely grooming what I now know to be the Deeren family farm. It would be years later before I understood what it meant to my grandfather to own that land in Sharon, Mississippi. If you know anything of sharecropping, independent farming, or federal government-controlled cotton allotment in the South during that time, you know that it was more than difficult for a Negro to be clear of debt and own their own land. My great-grandfather made certain that his children and their children's children would always own that land. And due to the Deeren family estate, we still do. The terrain of dirt roads in the country made them hard to drive on, but much easier to walk. Walking slowed us down long enough to hear his stories. How can we remember what we never even knew? My grandfather's formal education extended to the middle of 4th grade. He left school to work in those same overgrown fields I would groom many moons later. He grew older and left the South for Chicago, married my grandmother, and returned to Mississippi, where he organized, lobbied for voters' civil rights, and became a pillar in Canton, Mississippi, in the Canton, Mississippi community. Anne Moody mentions our family, in her novel, Coming of Age in Mississippi, the movement. She says, they were the one Negro family in Canton who had put their neck on the chopping block. Our family farm was one of the first freedom houses in Madison County. In that county, Negroes frequently turned up dead. Moody recounts headless corpses being found on the roads between Canton and Tougaloo, with K's cut into their flesh. There are the 13th, 14th, 15th amendments that make us citizens. The difference today is that my life isn't threatened for registering to vote, but wearing a hoodie might raise similar concerns. My family has a rich yet complicated history with this land. I still ride through the South and on occasion kept glimpses of bodies hanging from trees. I blink a few times to refocus my eyes. The noose may or may not actually be hanging from the tree. As I become more connected to my story, I notice the generational trauma that I cannot wish away. Baldwin says that one writes out of one thing only, one's own experience. In the text that was read, there is a similar image illustrated. It is the body of Judas hanging from a tree. I do not mention the horror of suicide without acknowledging what possible pain and suffering leads one to death by suicide. That being said, I cannot help but pay attention to the violent trauma in the text. In many ways, I am drawn to it. My descendants, some with gravestones and some without, suffered violence to their bodies. Harm was and is still done to black bodies. And that is the tricky thing about trauma. Our bodies hold harm in reminiscence. Our bodies hold harm in reminiscence. There's a connection to Judas's story and my own, a shared logic and a particular history I cannot ignore. James Cone said that theology starts with anger about a great contradiction that can't be ignored, and it emerges in response to the struggle for justice among communities of the poor. Valley of Slaughter, Jeremiah 19:6. Field of Blood, Matthew 27:8. Potter's Field, Zechariah 11:13. Judas's body hanging from a tree is an act of defilement to the land beneath him. But could there be meaning of Judas's death in the context of American soil and its particular history of defilement and innocent bloodshed? Matthew sets the story of Judas in a particular logic of innocent blood. Judas saw that Jesus was condemned and repented. He brought back 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He says, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. Jeremiah 19 parallels this logic and starts its horrific indictment with a declaration of sin, an emphasis on innocent blood. Hear the word of the Lord, O kings of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. The people have forsaken me and have profaned this place with idol worship and have filled this place with the blood of the innocent. Jeremiah is commanded to make this declaration in the presence of the elders of the people and the senior priests. Judas says to the elders of the people and the people of the chief priests, I have sinned. I have delivered up innocent blood. Matthew knows not only the Septuagint, but also the Hebrew text, and assimilates the story of Judas's death and Judas's innocent blood to the history of idolatry, innocent blood, and destruction told by the prophet. Jeremiah 19 is the history of a city and a people who forsake God. They worship idols. They shed the blood of the innocent, and the priests are complicit. The leaders do not listen to the prophet, and their persecution of the prophet puts at risk the future of the city and the land. Judas in Matthew does not stand alone. The blood money comes from and returns to the priests. The chief priests and the elders of the people have sentenced Jesus to death. and they take the blood money and buy with it a burial ground outside of the city. The problem with the blood of the innocent, according to Numbers, is that blood pollutes the land. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and no expiation can be made for the land, for the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of the one shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in which I dwell. Numbers 33 through 34. Judas and the priests are caught up in a defilement that haunts the land. Catherine Sider Hamilton proposes that tracing the intertextual echoes of Matthew 27 and Jeremiah 19 reveals a scriptural vision that finds in innocent blood a different problem, the specter of defilement. Such a scriptural vision finds in innocent blood not only an explanation for the tragedy that has come upon the people, but also the possibility of hope, precisely for the holy city. It is troubling that while Judas and the priests seem to both be implicated in delivering innocent blood, the priests refuse to listen to Judas. And because they do not listen, Judas hangs himself. Death by suicide should not be passed over, and neither should we skim this in our reading of Judas. Judas is no hero, but we should take a moment to notice this act of self-exclusion. Could we imagine Judas as an ordinary Christian, penitent, worthy of some level of human understanding? A repentant being who did exactly what he should have done before failing at the last moment to grasp and claim God's mercy. There is no shortage of modern fictional explorations, and I do not mean to implore them here today. But what is of great interest to me here is grace, and that tragedy does not have the final word. In both cases, destruction follows. In Jeremiah, in the future for Pashur and the whole people, but in Matthew, immediately for Judas. I wonder what would or could have been different if Judas was heard by the priests. I am paused by our present state of concerns, present state of affairs. We are radically separated with no reservoir of empathy for our kinfolk. If the priests who were far too complicit in the same defilement Judas was, failed to hear him, who would? Who would? Baldwin says that white people in this country will have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other. And when they have achieved this, which will not be tomorrow and may very well be never, the Negro problem will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed. I will never be white, nor fully understand the extent of what Baldwin alludes to. But what I can say is that what we must resist is the urge to categorize ourselves as us and them. There's a danger to this. When we do this, we ignore our own potential for evil. We perform acts of irrational refusal. We accept cowardice and a negative image of justice and love. We fail to hold each other with corrective love, care, and grace. The chief priest's refusal of repentance is not the whole story. Matthew, reading Zechariah 11, introduces the conscience of Judas that fails to be mentioned in any of the other synoptic gospels. The recognition of sin in the face of innocent blood. Judas says, I have sinned in delivering up innocent blood. In concert with Zechariah, Judas knows remorse and returns the money and confesses his own offense. These three things, feeling guilt, confessing the wrong, and making reparation, constitute in Numbers 5 and 6 through 7 the required reparation for wrongdoing, full restitution. Judas' death is not the end of the story, any more than the field of blood is the end of the story for Jerusalem. Judas repents and Jesus is delivered up. Beyond Judas' repentance and death by suicide, beyond the field of blood, beyond this American soil defiled by innocent blood, points forward toward another burial ground where, in the death of Jesus, death yields unexpectedly to life. I wrestled between ending on these two quotes, but I feel like I'm at home, so I'm going to say both of them. The cross is a paradoxical religious symbol because it inverts the world's value system with the news that hope comes by way of defeat, that suffering and death do not have the last word, that the last shall be first and the first last. And I do end with this, the end of this quote by Richard Blanco in his book, How to Love a Country. I was meant for all things to meet, the mirrored clouds and sun's tingle, bird songs and the quiet moon, the wind and its dust, the rush of mountain rain, and us, blood that runs in you is water flowing in me. Both life, the trust we know, be one in one another. Thank you.